heart is in South Kingston because I'm a retired culinary arts teacher from South Kingstown High School, where I taught family consumer science for 22 years. And now I'm trying something a little bit different. And as you know, this is, you might not know, but February was American Heart Month. And with that is, it's a time to draw an awareness to heart health. So I know it's beginning of March, but year round, we should be more aware of cardiovascular disease because based on research, 70% of it is preventable due to our diets and our lifestyle. So what does that mean? I'm here tonight to tell you about a healthy foods, but also to demonstrate how to make this rustic Tuscan soup. And there are certain ingredients that I'll be using. Well, all the ingredients are healthy, but they're heart healthy. And I'll talk about why are these heart healthy? What do they do for our heart? Well, basically, we want to keep our cholesterol levels low. We want to keep our sodium intake low so our blood pressure is controllable, and eat foods that are high in certain nutrients that help support the activity of the heart, like the muscle action and the arteries. And so let's get started. This is a series of 2. The next one will be March 24th, I believe, and I'll be demonstrating something from Milk Street Tuesday Night Cookbook. So getting back to the ingredients and some information about heart healthy foods. All right, I don't know if you had a chance to look at the recipe. I don't know if any of you are cooking along, but I hope you plan to do this maybe at a later date. But it's a fabulous one pot meal, and trying to cook in one pot or on a cookie sheet is my style. I love it because it's only one thing to clean. All right, so the ingredients in this soup, if you're looking at it, the stars of this soup are beans and greens. And so fantastic plant-based food, which is fabulous. But let's talk about the beans. The beans that I'm using are a good source of fiber and protein, potassium, and vitamins. But the main thing about the beans are that the fiber helps get rid of the LDL, which is the lousy LDL, the cholesterol. So that helps. And fiber comes from plant-based foods. So you'll find that with grains, with fruits, and vegetables. So fiber also helps, if anybody's diabetic, also helps stabilize the sugar levels. So all around, fiber's a win-win. All right. Potassium in the beans and the greens that we are using, really good for regulating heart rhythm, the muscle action needed for the heart. Okay, the greens we are using tonight, kale, spinach, escarole. I even have some collard greens, and I'll be talking about them when I start the cooking. But those are great. They're a powerhouse of nutrients and vegetables because of their fiber, A, C, K, folate, calcium, antioxidants. Win-win. All right. Fresh fruits and vegetables are necessary for a healthy heart. If you plan your diet around plant-based foods and then supplement it with protein from plants or animal-based sources, but first start with your fruits and vegetables. The key thing to remember is you don't have to be a nutritionist or a chef. What you have to do is remember visual. Eat the rainbow. You want your plate to be full of different colors, rich, dark colors. The more nutritious the vegetable or fruit, 99% of the time. So load your plate up with colorful vegetables. But is it okay to include canned vegetables or frozen vegetables? When you start eating canned products, you definitely want to look at the label because you want to read the label for ingredients. Say what is the sodium content? What are the other ingredients in the product? If you can't pronounce them, do you really want to be consuming them? Key thing around processed foods is sodium is used a lot for preservation, also to enhance the flavor is what manufacturers think, but it also creates a problem with hypertension. So the recommendation for sodium is about 2,300 milligrams a day, which is equal to 1 teaspoon. So I mean, there's a lot of hidden salt in our foods. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I talk about the broth as I'm adding it in. Just another 2 or 3 pieces of information for healthy or heart happy foods would be when you're thinking about fats, there are healthy fats, plant-based, nuts, seeds, peanut butter, this fatty fish for omega-3s like salmon and tuna. You want to limit your portion size when you're eating that, because when you're eating food from animal sources, think even a lean cut of chicken, of beef, of pork. You want to talk about portion size, the size of the palm of your hand, and about 4 ounces. So when you're visualizing that, you can look at your palm of your hand and see what that looks like on your plate. But fill your plate, the other part of your plate, if you're reducing your intake of food from animal sources, with whole grains and fruits and vegetables. Another mention about oils for heart healthy oils would be avocado oil, olive oil, canola oil, and foods that are high in saturated fat. We're talking about fats that aren't healthy, that you want to limit, or you want to keep it down to a minimum, because saturated fat, when you eat foods with saturated fat, tells your liver produce more cholesterol. There's something that the liver reads and it goes into action to produce LDL, which is not the healthy cholesterol. So you want to be careful about how much saturated fat you get and how much cholesterol. Cholesterol and saturated fat in animal sources go hand in hand. So think about portion size, think about lean cuts of meat, and think about trying to substitute once in a while plant-based protein sources, nuts, seeds, beans. There's a whole variety of plant-based proteins to choose from. Whole grains are a great source of fiber, and I'll be using whole grain pasta tonight. And the pasta companies have come a long way from when they first manufactured whole grains. The flavor is much better than it was 5 years ago. So I'll talk a little bit about that in the recipe when we start cooking. All right, so I just wanted to give you an overview of the heart healthy foods. Decrease your protein from animal fats, limit it to 4 ounces or less, palm of your hand. Eat a variety of fruits and vegetables, whole grains when you buy a product and you are trying to figure out how many whole grains is it healthy. I just want to come up and bring this to you. There is a little stamp on products that have at least 48 servings of whole grain in them. And this is put out by the Whole Grain Council. It's to help the consumer be able to make a choice about what food has whole grains. And why do you want whole grains? Because it's less processed. It contains a whole kernel, which means it's more nutritious and has more fiber than refined grains like white flour. So, all right, let's get started. All right, so we're going to start cooking. And we're making a Tuscan soup, and it's rustic. What does rustic mean? Can't hear you, so it's like, I'll just answer my own question. So I think I'm so funny, don't I? So anyway, I'll give you some entertainment. All right, so Tuscany in Italy, it goes from the northern part of Italy to the central part of Italy. It's and it borders the Mediterranean Sea on the west coast, and on the east coast, other little parts of Ity, of states, regions of Italy. And some of the larger cities in Tuscany you might have heard of is Pisa, Florence, Lucca, and Italians, regardless if they live in Sicily or the northern part of Italy, cook seasonally. There are very few packaged products in Italy. I was there about a year and a half ago, and I was surprised when you went to the market. Most things are in cartons, not in cans, and genetically modified foods are not sold in Italy. I think a lot of Europe has banned them. So it's around fresh ingredients, what's available. And in Tuscany, lots of different types of fresh fruits and vegetables. Since it's like the middle part of the country, if you go down to southern Italy, you will find more a warmer climate, more of the Mediterranean influence in that part of the country, more so than the northern part of Italy. Foods like wild boar, veal, anything that they can put in a sausage form, yes. And risotto or rice, and all kinds of pasta, many different kinds of cheese and breads. When you are preparing a rustic recipe, when it has the word rustic in it, it means it's home style cooking. It's what folks make in their kitchen, like whatever you made for dinner tonight, whether it be a hamburger or beef stew. That's home style cooking. Another word for that is rustic. So some rural part of Tuscany, and the food is presented simply prepared in season, in seasonal or seasonal ingredients, and maybe what they have in their fridge is leftovers they use. That, every part of the plant, like if you're making using celery, the leaves go in the soup. Nothing is wasted. So, and it's not over seasoned, and sometimes it's not even a recipe. It's just a little bit of this, a little bit of that, because it's homemade. In this soup, we're going to deal with texture. And this soup is like our comfort food, mac and cheese or beef stew. So there's not an exact recipe for, use 2 cans of beans, or I use 1 can of beans, whatever you have, and to your preference. Okay. So the texture that we're building in here comes from the vegetables and the beans. All right, we're going to get started. I am using, because I don't have the right, 2 or 3 cameras or somebody to operate the camera for a professional demonstration, I bought an electric soup pot. So that's what I'm going to be using. So I'm going to heat that up. And if you're cooking on the top of your stove, you want to start over medium heat. The first step in the recipe is to use oil. And you're going to heat your oil on medium. If you put it too high, you're going to have a problem. And the problem is going to be with the smoke point. And I'm not sure if you're familiar. So here's the olive oil I'm using. You can use avocado, canola oil, but olive oil complements this Italian dish because it is Italian. All right. So the olive oil has an average smoke point up to about 375, 400. You're not going to deep fry in olive oil. 1, it's too expensive, and 2, it'll start breaking down, which means that it'll smoke first, and then it breaks down and develops a burnt taste. So start your oil, no matter what you're cooking, even if you're going to deep fry, you want to start over medium heat. And so it says, the recipe says, in a large pot over medium heat, add olive oil. So that's what I've done. And how can you tell when your oil's hot enough? So I did add a suggestion, and I used to tell students this at school because I didn't want them to put the food in there and have it splatter, because it's safety. So this is a safe way to test your oil. You take any vegetable that you're going to add to this soup, and when it sizzles, you can tell that the oil is hot enough. So we are cooking with our senses, and which is fabulous. When you're cooking, it's a sensory experience. There's a lot of talk now, and I think it's very important that we're trying to stay in the moment, like with meditation activities that take a lot of attention learn something new. Cooking is something new. You have to pay attention and you have to be aware of what you're doing, but you're also engaged in your sense of smell. Now, I hear the sizzle. I'm sure you might not be able to hear, but it's sizzling. And that means the oil needs to go in. I could smell the aroma. Visually, I could see it. We're going to use our taste. We're using our sense of touch. So this is the carrots, the onions, and the celery chopped. And I even used the leeks from the celery. I hope you can see it. All right. This is a mirepoix, and I'll explain that in a minute. A mirepoix is a starting base for soups, stews, casseroles, and what the proportions to that, if you're following more the traditional culinary term, is that you are adding half onions and then quarter portions of celery and carrots. But for this recipe, they're almost all equal because we're not doing a formal recipe. This is a rustic recipe. So whatever you have, you had celery that looks like it, you're not going to serve it with a dip or put in a salad, put it in your soup because when it cooks, it's still good. Right. So this is going to cook for I want to show you how the size is not hot yet. You know, if you can see the size of the vegetable, I should put it on a napkin so you can see. The vegetables are kind of chunky. It's called a coarse chop. You don't have to mince them finely. You're not making chicken soup. Okay. So for this, it's a rustic soup. It's going to have some texture. And we're going to let that cook for a few minutes. Right. The next, there should be, I should explain at this point, when you are following other recipes, especially when you're making soup, you might read the word sweat or saute. Sweat means to cook the vegetable and release the water. Typically, you sweat onions because they have a lot of water, and then you see it release. The heat makes the water come out of the onion. Same thing with celery. Not so much with the carrot. There's not a lot of water in the carrot. If you feel the texture, it's firm. Okay. And you don't saute because the saute term means to stir constantly. In French, it means literally to jump around. So you're constantly stirring at a higher temperature and it might brown. We don't want these to brown. We just want them to cook. Oh, it smells so good. Okay, so let's get back to the garlic. Garlic's the next thing that you're adding. And a couple little tricks around garlic is, here's a clove of garlic. I'm not sure why it's so far away. Here's a clove of garlic. And with the clove of garlic, it has the skin on it. So let me move these ingredients out of the way so you can see. And a great way to release the flavor of garlic is to crush it or mash it before you slice it. And the way to do that is just get a tablespoon, back of the tablespoon, push on it, and the paper, the skin should come undone. All right. And you can smell the fragrance of the garlic because it's releasing oil. And that's what you want to do. You want the flavor of the garlic to release its oil. If you just slice it or mince it, you're not putting any real pressure on it to release the oil. So start like that, and then you can chop it, slice it, mince it. If you mince it too small, what's going to happen when you put it in hot oil? It's going to burn. And you don't want that dark, bitter taste. So a couple of tricks about, or hints about when you're cooking garlic is that you never put, if your first step says heat oil, put the garlic in. Start with cold pot or cold pan and cold oil, and then put your garlic in, and you heat up your oil slowly so that the garlic doesn't burn. Okay. So, but with this recipe, because the vegetables are already in, there's not a lot of surface that this is going to come in contact with the garlic. So it's not going to burn and the heat is not screaming hot, the oil. So I'm going to put the garlic in, just make sure I'm following my own recipe. And then I'm going to add the seasonings. So the garlic's going in, and I wish there was a way, let me see if I can hold this up somehow without everything falling out. Okay, so you can see that the vegetables are cooking and they're getting a little tender. And we'll give it a stir. All right, so next step, the seasonings. All right, I have measured, I hope you can see these seasonings. They're red pepper, that's an option. There is basil, oregano, parsley, and a bay leaf. And some of the other seasonings that are added to, this is a low salt recipe. So there's 1/4 teaspoon of salt for 6 servings. That's about 700 milligrams spread over 6 servings, which is really low. So if you are trying to reduce your salt intake and you are a person that seasons your food with salt, use other herbs to make up for that loss. Gradually cut back on your salt and you'll get used to that reduction. Your taste buds will change. The restaurant food we eat, especially at fast food restaurants, way too much salt. Even like something like Chili's or those types of restaurants, over seasoned. Some restaurants you go to, there's no salt and pepper on the table because the chef feels that they've seasoned the food correctly, and usually it's not over salted. All right, so this is a combination of all those ingredients, including salt, pepper, and I'm using parsley. I don't know if that's in the recipe, but I had it, so I thought I'd put that in. The neat thing about this, when you're using dried herbs, is that you want them to cook in the mixture before you add anything, the next ingredient, whether it be the broth or a liquid, because when they cook, they bloom. They release a little bit of they're dry, but release a little bit more of their flavor in this type of combination of ingredients without drowning out the taste, like just pouring in the liquid right after this. If any of you cook food, Indian food, all the ingredients, all the dried seasonings are bloomed, as they say, in oil just for a minute or two, just to develop the flavor a little bit more. Now, if you're using fresh herbs, you might have a question, well, what do I do with those? If you're using fresh herbs, how wonderful. You would put the fresh herbs at the end because they lose their flavor. So what do? If you have dry herbs, start with a small amount, maybe half, and then at the end, you add your fresh herbs. There are exceptions to that, flavors that do stand up to long cooking. And one would be rosemary. Okay, that's you wouldn't going to put this whole twig in there, but you would, because it's too woody, you would cut up your rosemary. You want to make sure that you get a nice soft rosemary. The leaves aren't stiff because that means it's old, so the flavor is not going to be that fabulous. So I'm adding rosemary to this. You don't like rosemary, you don't have to put it in, but it is a fresh herb. So I'm adding the rosemary now. If you're using thyme, that's another herb that stands up to cooking. But basil and oregano, fresh, not so much. And the proportion is 1 to 3. So if you're using 1 teaspoon of dried herbs, you want to add 3 teaspoons of fresh or tablespoon. Okay, so I'm putting the rosemary in, and let's see what other things have to go in, other ingredients. So I can smell all these flavors, all these aromas. Now, the next ingredient you want to make sure you have on hand. You can't substitute this ingredient. This is a bay leaf. And bay leaves give such a wonderful flavor to soups and stews. They're dried, more common. And whoops, the The thing about a bay leaf is that you want to take it out before you serve it because it doesn't break down. All right. You don't want somebody to get this in their bowl of food. So bay leaf, great depth it provides to the soup or the stew. All right, so the seasonings have bloomed, you want to call it that. And now I'm going to add the broth, the cherry tomatoes, the canned tomatoes to the vegetables. Okay, broth. You can use chicken broth or vegetable broth, whatever, because this could be a vegan recipe. This is unsalted chicken broth, so that's very healthy. This is low sodium. And what I did is I had another container open, so I'm using chicken broth. And I don't know if the recipe I sent out to Britta has the change 32 or 48 ounces. I did change the amount of broth to 48 ounces because 32 is not enough for this recipe. So I added the chicken broth to it. And I'm using fresh tomatoes also because it adds texture and brightness. These are cherry tomatoes that have been cut in half. And again, if you have cherry tomatoes in your refrigerator that you wouldn't want to use in a salad, put them in a soup. Or if you have large tomatoes, there's a lot more water in regular salad tomatoes than there are in cherry or plum tomatoes. That's fine. It's a soup. So the little bit of water will just add to the flavor of the broth. So these are the cherry tomatoes, 1 cup sliced. If you only have half a cup, that's fine. Whatever. It's not that exact, this recipe. You can change some of the proportions, but I would say stay away from changing the amount of sodium for it to be heart healthy. Okay, these are canned tomatoes. They're no salt. They have low salt, regular, and no salt. So pay attention to your labels, okay? A lot of companies make salt-free products now. They're not hard to find. I don't know what most of you are doing for your groceries, but I am not going to large grocery stores. I am doing curbside pickup from Stop and Shop and Walmart or wherever I could find the ingredients I need. So I do go to Dave's maybe once every 3 weeks, but I just feel that that's an environment. If I can have it, pick it up, great. Let someone else do the shopping, as I was in a grocery store for many years, 3 or 4 times a week for my classes. So I don't miss it. But when I order a product, sometimes it's up to the person that's picking the groceries. So it depends if they're seasoned shoppers or not. So we have the tomatoes in there, and now we have to let this cook about 10 minutes, I believe. Yes, to develop some flavor. This soup can cook longer. I just made it quick for a demo and one to show you that within a half an hour after the prep, you could have a whole soup and feed a lot of people, and it's really reasonable. All right. Moving on to the pasta and the beans. All right. The pasta I am using is what they call it, ditalini pasta. It's tiny. It's a tubular pasta, and of course, it's going to get larger. And it's a whole grain white pasta, which I don't know how they do that, but yes, the soup does freeze well. I see that one question because I'm close to the camera. So pasta goes in the soup, and I'm also using cannellini beans, which is going to give texture to the soup because I'm doing something a little different. I think I'm supposed to put the potatoes in. I haven't done that yet. All right, so I'm going to put the potatoes in too. All right, potatoes in a soup with pasta. Well, there are a lot of different cultures that have 2 starches in one meal. I think Portuguese food has 2 starches in one meal, rice and potatoes. These potatoes are going to add texture to the soup, but also to the broth because of the starch that will be released when they're cooked. And then the beans are going to add thickening, and then the pasta. So the difference between a broth, a stock, and a and bouillon. Talk about that in a minute. All right, so now the potatoes go in there. All right, the beans. Beans are a staple in the Italian diet, no matter what part of Italy you're in. And most of the time, people in the United States will use canned beans because they're convenient. But you could use dry beans, and there's a lot of ways to cook dry beans. Beans are an inexpensive source of protein, and they're really healthy. And a can of beans will be $1, and you can put some vegetables together, and you have food for maybe 4 people. Throw in the starch, and you can stretch your budget and your food. Okay, 2 bowls of beans here. Why do I have 2 bowls of beans? All right, these beans I'm going to put in the soup whole. These beans, I'm going to mash them a little bit to give some thickness and richness and different texture and flavor to the broth. All right. These beans have been rinsed. They were a low sodium bean. I put them in a strainer and I rinsed them under cold water, and about 40% of the salt's removed. So if it says, 600 milligrams a serving, 40% less, typically, depending on the brand and how well you rinse them and how thick that the juices that they're packed in. But it's a good way to reduce your sodium intake. So here's, I thought, a clever way to mash beans. It's just a little novelty. Put them in a larger bowl, get a glass, and just press on them. They're not going to be like totally mashed, but they're going to have different texture. And they're also going to add thickening of the soup. So again, I don't know. I think that's pretty different. I think that's interesting. I thought, what can I do to make this, something novel about the beans? All right, so we're still letting this cook about 5 more minutes before we add the pasta. Looking good, smelling fabulous. Turn it up. All right. The next thing I want to talk about is dry beans. If you are using dry beans, you're going to have to plan ahead because they're going to take time to cook. These are lentils. It's a type of legume. These don't have to be soaked. And lentil soup is fantastic. Another type of bean that you can use is navy bean. Tastes like a cannellini bean. It's very mild. These need to be soaked. And then I have some small red beans. They're like small kidney beans. All right, so any bean you can use in this soup. This package of beans obviously is going to increase in size because you're cooking it. It's going to absorb water like pasta and rice. With the beans, there are 3 ways to handle them in a recipe if you're using dry beans. One is, as they say, soak overnight. And what that means is soak 4 to 12 hours before you're planning to cook. Use them in a recipe. And you put them in a bowl or a pan. You have to sift through them first. Rinse them and then make sure there's no debris or little stones or soil, whatever, in with the beans. And then you fill the container. You want to fill it 3 inches above the beans and let them soak. 4 hours, 6 hours, 10 hours, and you want to put them in the refrigerator while they're soaking. All right. After they're done, rinse them off and you follow your recipe for the beans. Another way, if you don't have that much time or you're not planning in advance, you have to think about a shortcut. And one is like a quick soak. And that involves putting your beans in a pot filled 3 inches above with water and bring the beans to a boil. Then you just let them turn off the heat, take them off the stove, and let them sit for an hour. They'll absorb the water and plump up. And that's a shortcut to cook dry beans. Another way is forget the soaking and just cook your recipe longer, which means it requires a lot of stirring. Because if it takes 1 hour, you're gonna have to add a few hours onto it to cook. split peas, if you're making pea soup, or lentils, no soaking, they can cook in about 45 minutes. You don't want to boil beans, because if you boil even canned beans, what'll happen is they'll fall apart, the skins will come off, and they're supposed to taste creamy, not like mushy textured. So it's an art to cooking beans. If your family or your grandmother, or you eat beans, or you remember having them when you were growing up, they really taste good when they have a smooth, milky texture. Okay. All right, checking the time here. All right, so now the next step is to add the pasta and the beans. All right, pasta, because it's small, is going to take 6 or 8 minutes. If you use a larger pasta, it's going to take longer. But this broth, you have to bring up to a boil and then you lower it. You don't want to boil the ingredients that are in there, especially the beans. One tip I forgot to tell you about, if you're cooking your beans, if you're soaking them, do not add salt to them, because supposedly that makes the skins come off. And again, it doesn't help the texture. Add the salt at the very end. Okay, now I'm going to add the pasta. I'm going to add the mashed beans for texture. I don't have to add any cornstarch flour to thicken in this. Again, this is going to be more of a kind of thick broth, but it's going to have some texture to it. And that was the point of this recipe, is to give some texture to it rather than make it like a minestrone soup where it's more brothy. All right, double check my recipe. I got the pasta and the beans in there, and I'm going to let it cook. As you cook, you want to continue to stir, because as the pasta cooks, when it goes into the pan, it's going to go to the bottom of the pan. As it starts cooking, it gets soft, and you don't want it to get stuck to the bottom of the pan. So just a little bit of a reminder to stir. Okay, the next thing I'm going to talk about are the greens, because the greens are what contributes to the texture, the flavor, and also the amazing nutritional value and heart-healthy, heart-happy piece that we're talking about. All right, greens are hardy in the winter, and summer they're a little bit delicate. And in this recipe, I think the ingredients that you could add, let's see what greens I put on here. Spinach, kale, and collard greens. So being that I'm ordering my groceries, once in a while when I put down kale, they didn't have kale. I put down Swiss chard, they didn't have that. So they substituted, which I had, okay, do you want collard greens? I said, okay, I'll try that. It's not typical in Italian food because it's a southern green most of the time, found in different types of cooking, in American cooking and African cooking. All right, this first type of green is your typical kale. And like I mentioned before, kale is a powerhouse of nutrients, vegetable vitamins. And how do you use this kale? The stems you can't use because they're too thick. They're not tender, and they're only going to be cooking the last minute. So what you have to do is, with kale, the leaves are very easy to pull off. And I've done that some in advance, all right? Here's the kale, the leaves that I pulled off, but it's simple. If you want to destem this, what you would do is you would use a cutting board. You can use your hands too, but you also can use a knife, and let's cut this off. You would take your kale, fold it in half. You see the stem, and what you do is just use your knife and cut it out. And there you go. Take this, put it in your compost pile or use it in another dish. And here you want to break your leaves into bite-sized pieces. These collard greens only go in at the last few minutes. I mean, collard greens, this is kale. In Tuscany, kale is used so often that there is a variety of kale called Tuscan kale or dinosaur kale. It might even have other names, but this is just your typical American curly kale. You see that people grow this. Kale can be grown till November, maybe even December, maybe throughout the frost, but I'm sure there's folks out there that know more about gardening than I do, but kale is a wonderful vegetable to have around. These are, look at the size of these leaves. These are collard greens. These are beautiful. They look like a tropical plant, but they're not as tender as kale. They're a little bit tough. You have to cut them into really small pieces when you're using kale in a soup like this, because you're not cooking them a long period of time. If you're making them in like more of the Southern tradition, you would cook kale for like collard greens for quite a while. Same with this. The stem is very thick and not tender. It takes a while to break it down. If I had stems that I made a soup the other night and I had the stems I just chopped up really fine, I would have put them in at the beginning of this soup and let them cook a while, because cooking breaks them down. I'm de-stemming this just like I did the kale. But the cool thing I want to show you with this is I'm going to chiffonade this. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term. It's a French term for cutting greens or cutting any food into like ribbons. All right. How do you do this? All right. What I'm going to do is going to layer the leaves, and I'm going to fold them as much as I can. You can do this with basil, and then I'm going to roll it lengthwise. And you see, it looks like a rolled cigar. All right. Then I'm going to cut strips, and they're going to be very, like, maybe a quarter of an eighth, maybe an eighth of an inch. And what's going to happen is that's going to help make them so narrow that they don't need all that time to cook, because they're so small or thin. So that's called chiffonade. And okay, so this is what it looks like when it's cut. And then you can see what I meant by ribbons. All right, this is a little bit long. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just run the knife down the center of the strip and cut them. This will tenderize as it cooks because it's a small piece, as opposed to putting bite size. If I took the collard greens and I just broke it off in bite-sized pieces, it doesn't break down, as it's too fibrous. So when you're using greens like this, like a hearty winter green, you're going to have to cut it into really small pieces, and you don't have to cook it for so long because they'll be tender because they're so small. All right, in this bowl of greens, there's kale, there's a little collard greens. I had some spinach. I said, well, I'll throw that in. And it might be about 2 cups like the recipe states, but when it goes in, what's going to happen? It's going to wilt and it's going to shrink. So let's see how this is doing. Oh, it smells fantastic. Everything's cooking. Let's see how the pasta's cooking. The pasta's going to take the longest. And we're at the point where this might have to take, see how the pasta's cooking. It's cooking. Might need another minute, but I'm going to add the greens anyway. And because I'd like to answer some questions too while we have the time. So the greens will go in, and you want to cook them till they wilt. And the greens add such a wonderful color, another texture, flavor, and the nutrition. So it's a win-win with this because of all the fresh vegetables, and we use some canned products. But when you think about the cherry tomatoes, the mirepoix with carrots, celery, and onions, when you think about the fresh greens, you think about the heart-healthy beans, wonderful, and the fresh rosemary. I I wanted to talk a little bit about the garnish, but I did not toast the crostini because I only had 3 pieces left and I did not want to char them too much. But in Italy, in Tuscany, there is a bread that's all Italy knows originated in Tuscany. And it's a no salt Italian bread. Very, very neutral tasting. You know, if some people describe it as bland, but it's very neutral because there doesn't have any salt in it. And the Tuscans like that because in a lot of recipes, and the reason they have no salt, there are a couple of hearsay rumors, or what I found out on when I did research, is that one of the popes that was in charge at this one period of time was upset about how the Tuscans were living their life. So he said, no salt for them. So the Tuscans said, we'll make bread without salt. Another folk tale that I read about was about there was a tax put on salt because it was so valuable at this one period in history. And Tuscans said, well, we can't pay it, we'll just adapt. So they did. So they made this bread without salt. And it's famous in Tuscany, other regions too, but that's supposedly part of their heritage around this salt-free bread. Also, there are breads, soups in Italy called robolito or reboiled soup, where bread actually becomes part of the soup. They'll rip it up, not cut it in cubes, but rip it up and put it right in the soup bowl before it's served. Or it can go in a salad, this plain bread, and just tear it up into bite-sized pieces and makes a panzanella salad, which is delicious when you oil your fresh vegetables and some dressing like olive oil and vinegar. But being that salt-free, it's more of a palette, a background for other flavorful ingredients. It doesn't fight with the rest of the ingredients. So this is Italian bread. It's a crostini, small. You can toast it and put it in your toaster oven or in your oven. Just put a little olive oil on it, chop up some garlic, or if you have garlic powder, just a little sprinkle, just toast it. And even if you just want to toast one side, you can do that. So that's the grilled crostini. Crostini is delicious. More of a summer thing to do on your grill with more control than a grilled pan. All right, so do we have any questions? This has got to cook about 3 or 4 more minutes and then I'm going to dish it out.
All right, thank you, Kathi. We do have some questions right now. Let me go to the top of the chat. How many whole grains should we have a day? Most foods don't tell you how many whole grains per serving.
Question. I think it depends on basically, you want to probably think more about fiber than whole grains. If you're eating carbs, grains, half of your intake should be from whole grains. So it's hard to say that you need 70 grams. It's more about the amount that you're eating through the day. Make half of them whole grains from whole wheat foods like oatmeal, brown rice, farro, quinoa, those types of products, rather than white rice and white bread and white pasta.
Thank you. Someone said this is fantastic, that you were doing such a great job. It's not really questions to comment. The next question was, I have reflux. This recipe uses onions, garlic, and tomatoes, which are a no-no for reflux. Does cooking these veggies reduce the acid?
Yeah, so yeah, you'd have to probably keep those out. I would think the celery and the carrots would be okay, and maybe use other vegetables. But I understand about the acid reflux because of the acidity of the tomatoes. The potatoes should be okay. And the garlic, I'm not sure about the seasonings. I would think the fresh herbs would be better for acid reflux than the bitter dried herbs. I don't know if I answered the question or gave clarification. Other vegetables, I would just say you'd have to use something that what your digestive system can handle, that you don't get that reflux from.
Yeah, so just
Everybody's
kind of
different.
substitute things.
Substitute things.
Mhm. Right. If you don't have high blood pressure, is it necessary to restrict your sodium?
I would say that's probably a question for your care provider, but that's what I would say. Care for your, you have to ask if you don't have a history of that, but, or a nutritionist. Just being well-educated in nutrition doesn't make me an expert in heart health. But I would say that it does make sense to keep it, what the suggestion is, 2,300 milligrams a day, because that's the recommendation for everyone, regardless if you have hypertension. So I would say, yeah, just like sugar intake, it's moderation, and you're more aware of what you're. And if your salt intake is high, it's probably you might be eating more processed foods, because that's where you find salt, or if you're a ketchup salsa lover. So I think this is done. Okay. But this dish does freeze wonderfully. It's great. If I was going to freeze it, make a whole batch, just have one night and then freeze it, I would not add the potatoes, because potatoes do not freeze really well, but you can. And since there was a cup, not even a cup of potatoes in here, it's not that much, but I would definitely say, if you're planning on freezing it and you're making an amount like that, you can skip the potato. You can put green beans in here. You can put anything you want, basically.
That was one of the next questions about freezing, so that answered that.
Yeah.
Someone mentioned that the recipe that we sent out only called for 32 ounces of broth. So I just said this out of my own experience, that when you run out of broth, you can add water. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Add water, and that's the key. Add water.
All right.
So a garnish is something that you want to add to, if you can, add to your dish. We eat with our eyes first. I have some fresh basil that you could add, but it's also got the greens in there that serve as a garnish. It's just, it's amazing how bright these greens are, because they cooked a shorter period of time. Now, how am I going to show you this? It's going to be tough without it spilling.
I can see most of it. Yeah, I can see the green.
Can you see the beautiful colors?
Mm-hmm.
Look at the broth is sort of, orange almost. And then you have the vibrant, the greens aren't that bitter looking, like green, that's not so appetizing. And then you have the fresh, you can see the cherry tomatoes still maintain some of their shape.
Mm-hmm.
And the carrots, the color. So this one you eat with your eyes, it's packed full of nutrition. And then you can put this on the side. I mean, it's wonderful. I wish we all could sample it. I wish I was in person and we dish out little bowls and we talk about how we modify the recipe and what you've done. And the exchange with people around food is just so connected. It's that you find something that you can connect on, and then you think about the memories of when you got around the table to celebrate. And our life is a little bit different now, but that's coming back. It's coming back. So, and people are getting into cooking, which I think is wonderful, for your health and for your soul, makes you feel good. So a little bit of just a quick review: eat the rainbow, full of vegetables and fruit, whole grains when you can, healthy fats from plant sources, low fat or fat-free dairy, low salt and low sugar ingredients, portion control, 4 ounces on your animal protein sources, read labels, use food in their whole form or natural form if you can, and less processed food. Anything box bag, more than 3 ingredients or 5 ingredients and preservatives and chemicals. Try to limit that. So,
Thank
all
you.
right.
We have just a few more questions if you have
Sure.
time for that. Okay. Someone asked, what kind of pot are you using? Is that a countertop burner?
No, it's a plug-in electric. It has its own thermostat, like an electric frying pan in the olden days. So this heats up and it goes in. It's fine. I would rather cook on a stovetop. It does the trick for this. So that's, and I think it's Miro. Miro is the brand. So
And then someone asked, was the pot supposed to be covered while you're cooking?
yes, this particular recipe, because we want the vegetables to cook and we don't want to lose, when the pot's off, you're going to lose some of the broth because the steam, it doesn't escape too easily with this. So you want to keep it in the pot. It helps cook faster and it helps keep more broth. It doesn't evaporate. So yes, but you got to remember to stir.
Okay. And then someone asked, can it be simmered too long?
Maybe, but I would say you can taste it. I would say definitely taste it. Like over 45 minutes, done, because you don't want your vegetables too soft unless you prefer it that way. But the next day, the soup is magnificent. Flavors mingle, wonderful, wonderful. And also for Parmesan cheese fans, grate it, shave it, put it in while you're cooking if you like that, or just, put it on the table. However whatever cheese, Parmesan or Reggiano, whatever you have, it's a great added flavor. And I'm not a big Parmesan cheese fan, so I don't have it in my house often. But if you do have like a brick of it, a block of it, they say keep the rinds, which are the ends, and put them in the soup while you're cooking. It adds so much flavor. People rave about that. But I mean, it's a different time. We don't have those ingredients available because we're not shopping. We want to go in the store and run out, and our food has become simple because of we don't have all that time to wander around in the store. So it's changed.
And then one last question. Does Kathi have any web or social pages to follow? No.
No. I'm just no. I don't know if it's not a second career, but I'm enjoying it a lot. It's just it's fun. I've done some work with Farm Fresh and volunteered doing demos and some other programs that more or less in a paid volunteer. So it's like it feeds my soul, to educate and to help.
Well, we appreciate you doing this tonight. And if anyone wants to come to the second class, I think everyone really enjoyed it. The second class is March 24th, another Wednesday night at 6 p.m. So we can, if anyone wants to sign up for that, you can email me and I will sign you up for the second class and send you the Zoom invite information. And that night, Kathi will be cooking from Milk Street Tuesday nights.
I'm recognizing some of those names. Hello, everyone.
Oh.
Awesome. So is this going to be recorded? Is this recorded?
Yes, I recorded it. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, so anyone that missed it, a few people emailed today, said they couldn't make it. So I'll let them know that it'll be on our YouTube channel.
Yeah. And I'll email you. I was going to say, if you could send me the link of the Zoom recording before it goes, so I can see the chat maybe. It would be
Oh, sure. Fun. Yeah, I can save the chat too. And
yeah.
I'll send you the chat. Yeah. I'll do that before we end the meeting. A lot of people said great job and thank you.
All right. Well, it's my pleasure.
Thank
And
you.
the next time we'll be doing a basic, doing a dish called pasta alla norma. It's more of a vegetarian base, healthy heart with an arugula and a couple of variations of a vinaigrette, so we can have salad dressing that we make and control the salt intake.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you again. I'll email you the chat and then we'll see you again on March 24th.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Britta. Thank you, South Kingston Library. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye. Have a good night, everybody.